Series 5 of the 2025 50 Faces podcast is kindly supported by Diamond Hill. Diamond Hill invests on behalf of clients through a shared commitment to its valuation-driven investment principles, long-term perspective, capacity discipline, and client alignment. An independent, active asset manager with significant employee ownership, Diamond Hill's investment strategies include differentiated US and non-US equity, alternative long-short equity, and fixed income.
And the theory is that in order for fraud to exist, there needs to be three components present. The first is pressure. The individual has to have some type of internal or external pressure. Maybe they're getting divorced, they had to declare bankruptcy, they have gambling problems, whatever it might be, right? There's pressure to commit fraud. Then there's the opportunity. And then the third point is rationalization.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast that showcases inspiring professionals in the world of investment and beyond by focusing on people and their stories. I'm joined today by Rebecca Heun, who is a managing director of Aksia LLC, where she is a senior leader of their operational due diligence function. She has spent over 18 years at Aksia, and prior to that held a series of other financial roles. She's also an instructor for ILPA's operational due diligence course and is a certified fraud examiner. Welcome, Rebecca. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ethan.
Well, lots to unpack here with that set of qualifications and job history. And we, of course, met in Omaha. I should note that. And that was great to connect in person. But I'd love to hear a little bit about your career journey, going right back to where you studied. Can you talk us through that?
Yes, so it might be a bit unexpected, but I had no academic ambitions whatsoever. I wanted to be on Broadway. I wanted to be a triple threat. I grew up my life dancing ballet, was a major in the Royal Academy of Ballet, sang light opera, wanted to make sure I went to a university where I could do all those things. But I knew that my dad was not going to let me major in music, and then I had to do something a little bit more practical. So I ended up at TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. And the reason I went there is purely because it was the cheapest option for me because I had a choir scholarship. So it was actually cheaper than staying in my home state of Nebraska, which is why we met in Omaha. And I decided, okay, I'm going to study international economics because econ to me, all those different variables, putting them all together, it was kind of like completing a puzzle. I really liked how everything interrelated. It's really quite like what I do now in ODD. And at some point, my dad gave me some sage advice. He said, great that you're getting a degree in international economics. How about you add finance as well? That way you'll always have a job. I said, okay, Dad, I guess you don't want to support me financially, so I will go ahead and do that. And so I added finance, frankly, not because I was interested in it, but because it was a very practical thing to do. And TCU did have a good business school. So I decided to do that. Then I guess, how did I actually get into finance, though, from university? So I was adamant that I wanted to study abroad in Germany. And the only semester I could do it was the fall semester of my senior year. And that is the time that you should actually be interviewing for jobs, turns out. But I said, okay, I had a job offer already from Ernst & Young. I had started out doing an internship there the summer prior, doing fraud investigations out of their Dallas office. And actually, I didn't spend much time in Dallas. I had an apartment that was completely vacant. I spent the entire time in DC working on a very high-profile fraud, which really got me interested in the nuances of language. And I know that we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I was basically looking at language that people used in emails and determining whether or not I thought that they knew about the fraud, like were they guilty or not. So that was really cool. It was a cool experience. So I decided to just go ahead and accept that job offer on the condition that they transferred it to the New York office, because I knew I wanted to go to New York. Again, I had these aspirations of Broadway, and I didn't have the money to fly myself up to New York for interviews. So I said, I'm going to start in New York at E&Y doing fraud investigations. So that's how I got into finance. It was, I guess, for the money and to get to New York. So I did that. And I have to admit, I did not stay at Ernst & Young for very long because I realized that a very hierarchical structure was not in line with my personality. I love the 360. I love owning all aspects of a project and not being told that there's only certain things that you can do as a staff member. So how I got into ODD was all luck, complete luck. I can take no credit for it. But I was a little depressed, as you might imagine, in a job that wasn't quite working the way that I wanted it to for me. And I posted my resume on monster.com back when that was a thing to still get jobs that way. And pretty immediately, I got a call for an interview for Aksia, this complete startup at the time, back in 2006. And they wanted to interview me for an operational due diligence role to diligence hedge funds. No idea what a hedge fund was, no idea what operational due diligence was. And people look at some of the things I've done in my life and they're like, wow, you're a huge risk taker. I am not. I'm actually extremely risk averse, but I'm able to manage risk maybe a little bit differently than some people, or at least justify it. So I was interviewed in the kitchen of a serviced office space where Aksia had started up in the Chrysler building, where I had to move my legs so random people could walk by to get to the fridge while I was being interviewed. It was such a tight corridor. And I gave up my very secure job at E&Y and joined this startup of Aksia after it was founded by the partners, because I just saw pure passion in their eyes. And I said, there's no risk here. I know that they're going to make this work. So that's how I got into ODD. I can take no credit.
I love that trajectory. So interesting. So many different paths we could go down. First of all, in terms of the Broadway performer, there's actually, you'd be surprised at how many finance professionals actually do have a background either in dance or music. And it doesn't, I think, it's not a complete coincidence that they end up in roles where performance, poise, and I suppose some tolerance for rejection has to be part of the DNA. So really interesting there. And also that fraud investigation, I look forward to learning what you learned from that, because I think that probably beavering into the kind of recesses of duplicity and I suppose the most negative side of our industry, I'm sure teaches you a thing or two about red flags, and look forward to hearing that. Quite a lot of change just in terms of geography and sector. Would you say there were any surprising turns along that path?
Oh, yes. So I have been at Aksia for nearly 19 years, which I think when people see people who've been at firms for so long, they think, well, they must really be unmotivated. And I don't think that's the case here. At least I hope that's not the case. I've had great opportunities to kind of reinvent myself and have a lot of different roles at the firm. So one of the biggest surprises to me, I can't say I love living in New York. Okay, I'm a Midwesterner. I tried living in New York. I was there for 3.5 years. And I remember vividly a week where I went into the office and I'm like, finally, I actually get why people love New York. And that was the week that the partners asked me, would you be interested in moving to London to open up our European operation? So I just thought it was hilarious that 3.5 years in New York, I finally said, I think I really like it here. And I moved to London. So that was a very surprising turn. I didn't know that that was in the cards. It was amazing. I was 25. So to be able to have that opportunity was really unexpected. And I got to be the executive director there. I was also the CCO for FCA purposes. I did HR. I did legal. I figured out how to plug servers in for IT purposes, which was really scary. I did, all the accounting and all those different types of matters. But at the same time, I was still doing operational due diligence on all the European and Middle Eastern managers and building a team there too. So it was a lot of work. I mean, it was 2 full-time jobs at once, but it was so surprising. There was so much growth there in such a short period of time that it just really helped my career and understanding of business as a whole. So I think that was, one big surprise. And then unfortunately, following on from that, another big surprise was that when I hit 30, I kind of said, I think I want to move back to the States. I was a little burnt out. I had some family matters that happened back home that I missed because I was so far away. And then at the same time, I had this creative idea for a product that I wanted to invent. And it was just a harebrained idea, but I'm like, I kind of need to hit the reset button on my life. And so I was so lucky that the partners supported me in this because they allowed me to take a temporary step back from the firm. I was still working for them in a very part-time capacity, but it allowed me to experience something completely new and learn the world of entrepreneurship and bootstrapping a startup and, everything that comes with that. So I think that's surprising. And then I guess if I'm analyzing career trajectory also, I think we all have this perception that our careers should look very linear. Upward trajectory, very linear, no dips, no breaks, no anything like that. I I don't think that's the best way necessarily. That works for some, and that's truly what I expected my life would look like. But, other plans. Having some of those dips or experiences in other industries that seem completely unrelated is an amazing way to diversify your skill set, which you would never have gotten to do had you just stayed on that linear path. So I don't see it as a negative. The other thing is, I laugh because although I loved performing on stage, I was very confident. I actually grew up very shy and had major confidence issues. So I was never going to be one in a classroom to raise my hand and ask a question, because then that would mean, God forbid, I don't know something. And now it's hilarious because my entire job is to ask questions of managers where there's a complete information disadvantage here. They know everything about their business. I know very little. And my job is to bridge that gap and then make an assessment. So I've had to learn so many coping mechanisms and strategies for those insecurities to now be very secure in that. But it's just so interesting that my biggest insecurity has become my career.
What I think is also really interesting about that trajectory you mentioned is the ability to pursue a startup idea, but also not necessarily cut off all of your options. And I think maintain a relationship with Aksia. And I think that's truly extraordinary. And I think it's almost that out of the box thinking that people often think it's all or nothing. And often it can be and. I think, isn't that the rule of improv? It's yes and. I'd love to now move to that startup mode because it seems like it's been a completed experience. But can you tell us what you learned from that?
So much. So when you have a startup, it is like getting an MBA and probably like just as expensive, frankly, and way more frustrating. So just for people's backgrounds, I invented a kitchen tool called Trivae, TRIVAE. And basically it's a combination lid holder, trivet, and display stand in one. I invented it with my best friend and we thought it was like the most amazing idea. But that saying that the idea is really only 2% and execution is actually 98%. We did not want to believe that, but I can tell you that is 100% true. So I'm not actively involved in that business anymore, but I took away so many lessons and it has just really helped me to understand, portfolio companies. So I diligence a lot of private equity firms. So understanding the portfolio companies, the personalities that are within those portfolio companies, like you have to believe you can change the world when you're doing that. And that creates different personality types and challenges, I think, in terms of running a business effectively. But one of my biggest takeaways that works in any industry is when you're doing something new, you have to hire a lot of experts, but you can't outsource everything to the experts. So the way I see it is nobody cares about your product, your health, your child, your business, you, as much as you do. And nobody understands the true 360. So you can have a lawyer who's making some advice and it seems like very sound advice, but it ends up with unintended consequences from a tax perspective, or a tax accountant making advice that then restricts your marketing budget. Or in our case, you've got a lot of IP advice, which then affects the design, and the design affects manufacturing. But today's manufacturing standards, just because you can design it doesn't mean it can actually be done. And so then you have to make changes there, which affect your patentability. So you cannot outsource to experts. You have to become a jack of all trades when you launch a business. But again, it all goes back to those questions. You have to figure out what are the right questions to be asking these people so that I'm protecting myself and bridging that knowledge gap. So I would say that was, my biggest takeaway from startup mode. I loved it. There was a time for it in my life. I'm very glad that Aksia let me stay on in the process as well, because working for yourself is very hard. And yeah, it was just a joy to be able to do that. But also, I realized my skill set is where I am at Aksia.
So interesting. And I think that mode, and that's a very good point actually about the bit you can't outsource. It really just stresses just how you're always on in that kind of entrepreneur mode. You're never really switching off, but also just the importance of really being able to fully appreciate just how hard it is to win business, make contacts, and get that shelf space or catalog space or whatever it is you're looking for, how absolutely grueling that is. I have heard the philosophy that everyone should spend time in sales because it's essentially the most humbling jobs in the world.
So it is. It's so painful.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it never gets any easier. I think that maybe you become a thicker skin or more resilient, but it's still, the job itself is still never very easy. And I think operational due diligence is an area that often doesn't get as well understood. It tends to be, speaking of your start with fraud examination, It often is kind of the point of failure for many blow-ups and fund failures, but is not getting nearly the attention perhaps it deserves. So I'd love if you could just paint a picture for the ODD landscape today. What's at the forefront of your mind, and how is AI transforming all of that now?
Okay, that's a lot there. So for people who might be unfamiliar with operational due diligence, when you're doing investment due diligence, there's potential reward there and also risk. But at least there's some risk that's commensurate with the reward, hopefully. In operational due diligence, there is no potential reward. There's only downside. There's only risk, which means that those risks have to be added to the investment risk to assess the entire picture to determine whether or not the investment return is big enough to justify taking on all those risks. So some investors in the past have not accounted for the ODD risk, but I think that the industry is absolutely changing in that regard. We have a lot of people getting into ODD and trying to figure it out and develop processes in-house and with limited budgets and resources and travel budgets as well. So it's a difficult time in the sense that there's so many people starting to do it now. And the reason why that's partly difficult also is because they're learning, but they're learning on managers' time. And that sometimes makes it more difficult to access these managers for more practitioners like myself, if that makes sense, for the managers who are not as used to it. So I have some thoughts on AI. Everybody's talking about AI. I mean, you go to any conference these days and every single session mentions AI. So fine, we'll talk about it too. There is a lot to focus on in terms of AI, on big data. There's absolutely applications from an operational due diligence perspective as well. And it really is doing incredible things. I mean, the fact that it can analyze, huge amounts of data in addition to summarizing very long policy documents, I mean, that's a win in theory. But I have some caveats to that. So with managers using AI to bolster their policies so they look really good on paper, and they can use AI to compare all of their documentation to look for inconsistencies, that actually makes our job harder as ODD practitioners because we care very much about wording choices. And I want to know exactly how the manager worded it, not some watered down version of AI having scrubbed it and then it being spit out to the LP and then the LP using AI as well and also watering it down. Like it's too many filters. And now we don't have the original language to analyze intent. I'll give you an example. DDQ questions, so many DDQs are sent to managers, and we may ask a very specific question, and a manager may come back and they answer the question, kind of. I mean, it's that typical gut feel where you're like, I think they answered the question. Oh, but actually, if you analyze it, they put some limiting words in there. So they didn't perfectly answer the question. So you really have to have fine attention to detail. Well, that type of stuff may or may not get caught. And that's what scares me a little bit. So we care about the inconsistency in documentation because it's also a sign that they're not doing on a day-to-day basis what they say they're doing. So when we're going in and we're meeting with managers, those are some of the things that we're looking at. I also think, as an industry, we would do well to keep at the forefront of our minds that AI doesn't run businesses, humans do, and humans are fallible. I talk a lot about psychology. I have a fraud background. I'm a CFE. I always teach about this concept, so I'm going to teach about it here too. If you haven't heard about this and you're in due diligence, you need to look this up. It's called the fraud triangle. Have you heard about it even? Okay.
So no, and I've got this long in my career with that, so I'm fascinated. So please proceed.
So really well-known criminologist by the name of Donald Cressy in 1953 came up with this theory. And the theory is that in order for fraud to exist, there needs to be three components present. The first one is the opportunity to commit fraud. So this is like internal controls and governance. This is where people classically think that ODD lives. And I don't completely disagree with them. That is where ODD lives. But there are two other sides to that triangle, and we would do well to not ignore them. The first is pressure. The individual has to have some type of internal or external pressure. Maybe they're getting divorced. They had to declare bankruptcy. They have gambling problems, whatever it might be, right? There's pressure to commit fraud. Then there's the opportunity. And then the third point is rationalization. And this is where it gets really fun, kind of delving into the psychology of individuals. Because if you actually break down frauds that have happened in the past, like big name frauds, even some of the smaller ones, you'll find that those individuals who committed fraud are often on the boards of a ton of charities where they're really outspoken about ESG things or about doing good in the world. And I am all for that. But when somebody is really outspoken about that, about ethical issues, I take a step back and I say, we just need to analyze this very, very carefully because they can be doing that to be rationalizing some of their other bad actions. So I think the fraud triangle is an excellent theory. Again, it's a theory, right? Nothing is perfect, but it seems to be the best working theory that we have. So why do we consider those other things? Businesses don't commit fraud, people do. And so we have to analyze their motivations. So the other thing is, in ODD, we have to remain focused on the qualitative aspects. ODD is inherently qualitative. I mean, we're not really dealing in large amounts of data the way that investment due diligence analysts are. We are dealing with words and characters of individuals. And what's really interesting is, and nobody can really agree on this statistic, by the way. Some people say it's 93%, but I think generally people agree that it's more than 50% of communication is nonverbal. So it is not the words that you are necessarily saying. That is very important, again, has to be analyzed. But it's everything else. It's how we act. It's body language. It's the sideways glances showing your insecurity or deferral to somebody else. It's the tone of voice. It's the cadence of how you speak. Any type of deviation from your normal baseline. This is extremely valuable information to be picking up on when diligencing a manager and ultimately entering into a long-term relationship with them. It apparently is very important to learn as well if you have kids to see if they're lying to you. So TBD on that one. I have a 3-year-old. We're starting to get to that stage. So the biggest fear that I really have, though, with regard to people's reliance on AI is just the delusion of all of these qualitative and psychological elements, especially as people are giving up doing due diligence on site in the name of efficiencies and cost savings. And I completely get those pressures. But for us, going on site is such an important part of our process. It always has been. It is a non-negotiable for us. And now with managers being able to use AI to be creative and bolster their policies to make them look more robust, I just think it's something that we all really need to be on the lookout for. So that's kind of of where I think things stand.
That is just so interesting. And just a couple of things to kind of react to there. One is this idea of a kind of like a mental accounting. It seems that is going on around fraud and compensation, perhaps in another walk of life. I've never drawn that connection, and really intriguing to look at that maybe the opposite behavior maybe as a justification. And then you mentioned the on-site visits. Do you think then that during COVID, when everyone thought that the tire kicking could be replaced with, long Teams calls, do you think something could get lost perhaps in that? I mean, that doesn't seem like it would be a good substitute because you miss the in-person kind of look and feel.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that people were still able to function, especially if you already had a relationship with that manager, right? The bigger risk was for new manager relationships. We were still able to find comfort, but the way that we have built our process, and again, like my main focus is, okay, it is impossible to pick up on 100% of information. Even if you are the most hyper-focused individual, you do not take your eyes off of the individuals that you're meeting with to take notes or, type something so that you don't miss any physical cues. And you are hyper vigilant about every word that you hear. Like, it is impossible to collect 100% of information, but you can train yourself in a way to get better and better at it. I actually sometimes have to remind myself to look away from people. Like, I can flip pages and know exactly where I'm going. I still handwrite all of my notes. And sometimes I have to remind myself, okay, Rebecca, that's a little bit weird. You need to look away so that you don't make them uncomfortable. But like, I don't want to miss anything, right? So I think that, there are elements of things that can get missed from not going on site if people are not even more vigilant on the verbal side of things. The other thing with Zoom, which I don't like, and I've done a lot of teaching and speaking on Zoom as well. We, even with OPA, we had to do some online deliveries, is your natural reaction is to look at yourself in the camera. Even now, right? You're not looking at other people necessarily. So you're distracted. you're distracted. But then also, of course, you don't get the full body language. And it's also harder from a manager's perspective, frankly, because a good manager wants to instill that trust in you. But there is a subconscious component that if you cannot see their whole body, or at least, most of their upper body and hands, it is harder to gain trust. I don't know what the psychological principle is, but that's a thing. So I think that the world can still function. I just don't think that it's best practice if you can avoid doing remotes.
So interesting. And just to finish on the ODD topic, the past, as I mentioned, some of the points of failure, the past and what we've learned from them. Do you think we've learned any lessons? Are we fighting the last war? Or there's another way of asking, I suppose, where do we need to focus today for the most, maybe where could the cracks appear?
Sure. Okay. So have we learned some lessons? Yes and no. I feel like every answer with me is probably yes and no. So yes, in the sense that, every time there's a new fraud that comes to light, the industry takes a pause and it's noticed. And it helps ODD practitioners bolster their processes, but it also helps from a regulatory standpoint because that inherently means there's going to be more regulation. Bad news for managers, potentially good news for LPs, right? So for instance, and it's usually by the way, the big name frauds that make a difference. There are frauds that are discovered almost every day and they go unheard of. But Madoff, of course, changed the industry for hedge funds. And then Abraj, the largest private equity fund fraud that we know of, at least out of Dubai, that suddenly woke people up to realizing that, oh gosh, we need to be diligencing private markets funds. Okay, we didn't think that was a thing because you're locked up in those funds for so long. But it's actually way more important to be doing proper ODD on those manager relationships before you're locked up then. So yes, I think that there's always some positive change that comes out of that. But the problem is that there are some other aspects, I think, that hinder progress. So with those huge pushes to do more ODD, while there's still budget constraints, it means there's more people out there doing it that might not have strategy-specific understanding, might not be asking the right questions. We talked about manager access potentially being an issue. And the ODD professionals may actually be missing the most important elements to be considering with regard to a manager. The other thing is, we are all humans. Everybody is still biased. And I see it all the time. People still succumb to groupthink. They still mention, oh, well, this other big endowment or pension fund is invested, so they must have good due diligence procedures, right? And we just don't know what other people's biases or due diligence procedures are. So you cannot use that as a proxy for doing your own work. The other thing is, people still override their gut feels if they see high returns, even if they know that something's wrong. That's effectively what happened with Madoff. And a big one that I see in the market right now, that I see very commonly with LPs out there, is these really hard to get into VC managers and how willing people are to accept whatever the state of their operations. It doesn't matter. It's so amazing we've finally gotten access. And so we're investing regardless, right? So that is out there as well. And we hear that in the industry all the time. So I think that those are some of the things that I see. And the best thing that we can all do is when there's a new fraud, a big enough fraud that it makes you interested, right? Whenever you see the SEC come out with their new charges or the DOJ charges, et cetera, read them, delve into that like a case study review, figure out if your current procedures could have picked up on that or not, and where you can bolster them. But also keeping in mind that a lot of frauds happen with collusion. And collusion is something that ODD cannot necessarily pick up on, right? So ODD is not perfect either. But really spend the time doing the deep dive to see what you can do better. The other thing is we're also reactive. We're also busy, right? And so it's very easy to be reactive in the industry and, oh, now this regulation's come down. What does that mean? How could that affect my managers? We all need to be evolving, not just the way that AI is forcing us to, but start being more predictive about what some of those changes are in the industry. and how managers could also be better protected. So here's one idea that I have that I try to share with some managers, especially in the private equity space and venture. Managers love to make news announcements about new acquisitions. And where do hackers live? In the news. And if they see a new news announcement about an acquisition that's coming up, they know there's going to be transactions between them. And who are they going to target? The private equity firm or the new portfolio company? Both. But PE firms are pretty educated on cyber risks at this point. They're really going to try to target that portfolio company because depending on the size, they probably haven't been as educated. They're not as institutionalized. And so it's really ideal for private equity and venture capital firms to be training their portfolio companies on cyber risks, but also maybe delaying that news announcement until the deal has been funded. So that's just one example.
We're going to take a short break to hear from the sponsor of this series, Diamond Hill. I sat down with Heather Brilliant, CEO of Diamond Hill, and asked her how she thinks about the primary stakeholders of the firm.
We talk a lot about our three primary stakeholders as being our clients, first and foremost, as we discussed, and then secondarily, but also critically important, our employees and our shareholders. We are a public company, and so that is an interesting dynamic in terms of making sure you're looking after your shareholders as well. But we ultimately believe that we can do the best job of delivering for all stakeholders by focusing our effort primarily on our clients. In order to do that, of course, we have to make sure that we are attracting and retaining great talent, both on the investment side of things as well as across all of our teams. And so we put a lot of effort into how we think about recruiting. Over the last few years, we've made a number of changes to making sure that we're looking in new areas to attract talent that comes from diverse backgrounds. And I think that's really helping make us a stronger firm.
And now back to the show. That's so interesting. I love that idea because obviously we focus on transparency, but equally then maybe not necessarily needing to be super transparent or maybe preemptively transparent, just being, I think, cautious about the need to constantly share that may or may not be necessarily absolutely essential. Our clients, because I didn't actually know until I read the bio here about the being an instructor on the ILPA's Operational Due Diligence course. And what is it that I suppose is at the edge of what clients are wanting to learn there and to focus on when you think about needs changing around ODD?
Oh, sure. And not specific to Axia's clients, but just ILPA, the LPs in general in the industry that we work with around the world. Sure. First of all, I've got CIOs in that class all the way down to investment analysts. I've got back office people. So it really is a wide representation of the industry who's trying to learn about ODD, the importance of it, bring it back to their team. Some of it is to build a case internally for why we should have more resources for ODD. And others is truly CIOs who are saying this is a huge risk for us and we need to figure out how we can mitigate it. I think one of the biggest challenges that people face in general is internal buy-in, as well as, of course, the resources. But a really big one that I'm seeing is, great, we've got the resources. We're starting to identify some of these risks, but how do we actually weigh them? Like, how do they actually factor in to the investment decision? Because this one looks pretty concerning. So should we kill the deal? Whereas actually it's one that is quite common for that specific strategy. And it just is a risk that you have to accept when investing in that strategy. So it's a lot of education on how, or at least the way that, we see it at Aksia is, risks in and of themselves are not necessarily additive. So you could have 12 different ODD related risks, but none of them are particularly meaningful. Or you could have 3 risks, which you really don't want to see together because this one coupled with this other one, coupled with that one, the perfect trifecta of something we are not comfortable with. So the number of risks doesn't matter. It's about figuring out what are your absolute deal breakers. Like, do you need an administrator? If you're investing in a hedge fund, 100% should have administrators. If you're investing in private equity, it depends on when the firm was founded as to whether or not they have an administrator or not. And, there really shouldn't be any black and white. It should be a very creative, robust discussion and process and negotiation internally along with the manager to figure out how best to mitigate that risk. But there's 2 main pieces of advice that I would give. One, every business has operational risks. If you did not move forward because there was an operational risk, you would not invest a single dime. So One is the potential investment return high enough to compensate again for that investment and operational risk. And two, and you know what, this is probably the better litmus test. Is your team going to be able to sleep at night knowing that you're invested in this manager? If the answer is no, that's a great gut feel to say, just walk away. There's plenty of other fish in the sea. Don't override that. That would be one piece of advice that I would say.
So you have a wide range of other interests, and we've already touched on some of those, from the Broadway aspirations to entrepreneurship and invention, creating kitchen tools, and then the richness that you enjoy within finance. But you have additional outside interests as well that we touched on in our Omaha conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about those and how they feed into your professional profile?
Oh, I have so many interests and so little time. I'm at a stage in my life where I have a 3-year-old. My husband and I both travel for work. So juggling hobbies is just not really in the cards for us right now. So the interest that I'm able to pursue, I would say, so we love to garden. We live on an acreage. So I love fresh food, growing everything, preserving it. I'm turning into my grandma. And that actually feeds into probably the thing that I'm most passionate about, that I've actually spent the past 7 years researching, mainly out of necessity, unfortunately, and that is health. And specifically the intersection of how to retain your health and vitality while working in a very demanding career field. So, there's a saying that I love and I hate at the same time. You can have 1,000 problems until you have a health problem, and then you have only one. And I think in the stressful world that we live in, we really need to focus on changing our relationship with stress and also the perception of stress. Like, it is a mind game. Finance, it is a high stress industry. I'm not discounting that, but it really is not life and death. My little sister is a neonatologist dealing with premature babies. That is life and death every day. That is true stress to your core. So if we can change our perception around stress and what we do, I think that can have a huge impact. So interestingly, just thinking about something stressful, even if it's not real, it's just worrying about the future, your body sees that as real stress and it creates a real physiological change. So about 7 years ago, when I started having super strange symptoms, I went from doctor to doctor and got no results. I mean, so many lab tests, and everybody told me it's probably just stress. And me being like the researcher that I am, I'm not okay with that, like, just generic response, because I don't understand how stress can result in physical manifestations. So I've gone through this process of just really trying to internalize this and figure out what it is. So I'd love to share those connections if that's okay. Save your listeners some years on their lives. So
please do take us through.
Okay. The risk manager in me says, I will add a disclaimer here. This is not medical advice, but the 30,000 foot view is this. I just think it's so interesting. I mean, just again, simplifying this, stress leads to higher cortisol. We've all heard about cortisol. High cortisol, basically cortisol is such an important hormone that in order to keep you alive, it will steal from all of your other hormones. But high cortisol affects your sleep. And if you sleep poorly, we know what that feels like. You do not feel your best the next day. So how are you going to operate in a professional environment where you're expected to be on your best behavior, making really high stakes decisions if you're not feeling well? Not a good combination. When you don't sleep so well, you actually have more reactive blood sugar the next day, and you're craving sugar. And so then you eat the sugar, it spikes your blood sugar, and then it drops so substantially. And then that encourages you to eat more sugar. And this ends up becoming just this self-fulfilling prophecy. The cycle never seems to end. What that ends up doing, though, is it creates inflammation in your body. And this is the key. And what was my biggest cause is inflammation is ultimately the root of all disease, whether it's cancer, heart disease, autoimmune, you name it. And so it's all about going back to the beginning and saying we've got to reduce stress so that we don't create this negative cycle. And again, some stress is good. I actually operate super well under high stress, which is like, I love stress. It makes me perform really well. But at some point, these type A overachievers like myself actually become low cortisol. because you've used up all of your hormones. Your body is so depleted, and then you just completely flatline. And so you might be able to operate this way for 10 to 15 years, but then you're at the height of your career and you start having these weird symptoms and health challenges. And I have met so many people, mainly women, who are vulnerable and open enough to say, it looks like I have everything together. I do not have everything together. I'm not feeling well. I am not sleeping well. I haven't slept for weeks and it's not related to my kids. And how am I supposed to continue performing at this level? So I just think it needs to be a huge thing that we focus on and reduce the stigma around and start talking about early. But people later in life, like me, who have had the experiences that I have, need to be sharing with especially women, because women, we're just so much more complex hormonally that more things can go wrong. But sharing with everyone that in your 20s and your 30s, you need to take care of yourself. You need to find ways to control for that stress because you don't see it now. But the way that I share with people is you have, like, picture an inflammation bucket. All of the poor insults, the bad sleep, bad food, environmental toxins, whatever it is, it all goes in your inflammation bucket and nothing happens to you until it starts overflowing. And by then it's kind of too late. So it's really difficult to bring things back in. So that's really what I'm very passionate about now. Thankfully, well, good and bad. I'm a canary in a coal mine. So one minor insult can put me over the edge, but it also means that I'm able to test out a lot of different things to see what works to bring me back into balance. So I love sharing that with people, reducing the stigma and just kind of encouraging people to focus on those things that I should have focused on. And I wish that somebody would have told me about when I was in my 20s, just killing it at work and not focusing on my health.
Well, thank you for your service to a whole body of professionals here with calling that out and explaining it so well. And I think another to add to that, perhaps we know it's very real right now, is the doom scrolling, the devices, the always on nature of our communications. That seems to also be adding to stress. And I think it's only as I talked about fighting the last war before, as we're gaining the tools to fight the prior sources of stress, I think it's difficult to also try to cope real time with the current and evolving sources of stress. So,
and can I add to that?
Sure.
Like the whole social media thing, what it ends up doing is it depletes your dopamine receptors. So you actually become addicted. It also is one of the biggest instigators of us not being able to do deep work anymore. So I am most fulfilled when I shut off all distractions at work and I'm able to sit down and really spend time researching a topic or writing a report and just doing truly deep work. You get into flow. None of us get that anymore. The way that we have structured our lives and are constantly on and constantly getting notifications in social media. So it is a huge source of stress to ourselves.
Well, to be continued, I think, on that conversation. I think we'll have to revisit it as part of our wellness series and hub, because I think a really essential tool is to have a toolkit to be able to cope with that. And that toolkit usually comes from others sharing their experience. I'd love to just finish up with some quick personal reflections, as we've had such a wonderful picture painted here of a career that had its twists and turns, but was nonetheless fulfilling and stimulating along the way. Any high or low that you can mention? And when it comes to the low, any lesson you took from that?
Oh, well, from a career perspective, my lowest point was when I was working at Ernst & Young, basically working investment banker hours on an accountant's pay, having no money in New York and living in a cockroach infested apartment. So, I mean, you can't really get much worse than that. So that was a low. That was really kind of a downtime in my life. But also I had just moved to New York and I really didn't know anyone there. So I think there were just a lot of elements there. I haven't really had any lows at Aksia. I've had a lot of highs. I would say there's probably two that stand out. One that just like is so exciting. When I was 22 and I joined the firm, like very early on, we got to diligence the Madoff feeder funds. So I got to do a deep dive into that. And I won't go into it here. If anybody's interested, you can just Google Aksia Madoff and see some of the work that we did there. But it really completely affected not just the industry, but my whole career trajectory. I mean, you start a new job, you're kind of interested in it. Oh man, I was so interested after that, right? So it was the best thing to happen to me upon joining Aksia. Plus, then we got to build our program around that. with our investigative mindset and apply that to every diligence thereafter. So that was, I mean, that was such a high. I still remember to this day the energy in the office when the news broke about Madoff. So just so life-changing there. And then the second one is truly opening the London office, and more so just around that, just being in a supportive environment where the partners trusted me to do that and put faith in me at that age. I mean, that was just such an incredible opportunity that I'm so grateful for. So that is definitely a high.
And we mentioned some of these people who had faith in you. Did you have any formal mentor or anyone that was particularly pivotal in the course? And you mentioned your dad, so he obviously set you on an important track.
Yes, my dad is very practical. Well, I guess my parents always inspired me. And I have always taken this to heart. They drilled it into me from childhood. Thank goodness they did. They said, Rebecca, the world is your oyster. You can do anything that you put your mind to. And they just repeated it so much that I truly believed it. Like, I did not doubt it. I think if I doubted it, I wouldn't have done half the things that I've done in life. Thankfully, though, so that I didn't get too big for my britches, they also taught me some ways to keep me level-headed. So I'm very appreciative for that as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that they really just helped me to be open to opportunities, to, curveballs, to creativity, to be open to reinventing myself and all of that. And what I found is when I am in that more creative, optimistic, expansionary mindset, life is way more joyful. And when I'm in a contractionary, pessimistic mood, it really is not. So I try to go back to that. I'm not perfect in it. Then in terms of like mentors, though, I don't think I had the foresight, to be honest, to look for mentors. And I think part of this might have also just been my insecurities, but also I had built-in mentors at Aksia because I got to work so closely with all of the partners since I joined it as a startup and see how the business grew. And so I learned just by observing to a certain extent, but I also took the view that everybody has valuable information to share. And so I'm going to ask them questions like, hey, why did you do it this way? What was your thought process there? Do you have any regrets? Would you have done it differently? And so I annoyingly ask people that I just met on a plane questions like that. I try not to be that person who talks on the planes, but on occasion, if you meet somebody interesting. And so I just decided that I would let everybody mentor me a little bit. But I really do have a lot of respect for the younger generation who has the boldness to reach out to somebody more senior and ask them, will you be my mentor? Or will you mentor me specifically on this one point? I really think it was my insecurities that stopped me. And part of that is because I always feel like I need to bring more to the table, like give more than I get. And so I didn't want to be the one asking and being a burden. But I do regret that slightly.
I think that's a really interesting nuance. It's about how you ask to be a mentor. It's on this point, not general, because the general open-ended mentorship is actually quite stressful on the mentor because you're going to don't know what you're supposed to be doing or whether you're hitting the mark. And I think it's also that openness to maybe not being omniscient that the youth often think they are, and the vulnerability to ask and to really take control, I think, of their own career and not expect others to control it for you, which I think can be a common belief, especially in larger firms. So just wonderful insights there. And my last question is about any creed or motto or word of advice. Is there anything that you heard or that you have internalized now that you can share?
Besides what my parents told me, right, to keep my optimism high and believe in myself that I can do anything. I don't think it's a motto or a creed, or it's a saying. It's a saying probably that I would choose. And it was something that a very dear friend of mine, who sadly passed last year at the tender age of 84, he had great wisdom. And he knew that I'm very high stress and very conscientious. And he would constantly tell me to internalize this phrase. And I remind myself of this very, very frequently. Anxiety is predicting failure in the future. What a waste. What a waste.
Yeah, that is a great way to think about it. And I think it really squares with the positive thinking, but not necessarily believing that, not being on guard. But I think anxiety is very little positive to say. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. This has not only been a masterclass in everything ODD related. You have given us the nuance, you've given us the history, and you've set the stage for the future of evolution of that. So I will be carving this out on the website as a go-to source for anything ODD related. But you've also, I think, in a very human way, stressed just the human component of everything that we do, how hard it is to bring a judgment to bear, and how hard it is to actually figure out what's going on behind the curtain. And it gives a lot of reassurance that this will always involve the human aspect. And your insights and research on stress is a very generous contribution to our industry's understanding of that, because I think we all have a long way to go. So thank you for this wonderfully insightful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Ethan.
I'm Ethan Devitt. Thank you for listening to our 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring professionals on their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.